An avoidant doesn't bond easily. So when they do, it changes the architecture of their nervous system. Avoidants are wired for control when it comes to closeness. They don't move toward intimacy the way emotionally open people do. They approach, then retreat. They allow connection in measured doses. They regulate how much access someone has to their inner world because closeness, for them, has historically come with cost, pressure, expectation, emotional responsibility, or loss of independence. Over time, this creates a highly refined internal system designed to keep attachment manageable. They aren't heartless. They're self-protective. And most people never get past that protective layer. But a super empath doesn't try to breach those defenses by force. They don't demand vulnerability. They don't flood the avoidant with emotional intensity or expectations. Instead, they enter through something far more disarming: safety without demand. There is warmth without urgency, presence without pressure, care that doesn't come with an invoice. And because nothing is being asked for, nothing needs to be defended against. The avoidance system doesn't go on alert. It relaxes. This is where the usual rules stop applying. There's no chasing to trigger withdrawal, no emotional interrogation to spark shutdown, no forced talks that overwhelm the nervous system. The empath doesn't try to be let in. They simply, and that subtle difference bypasses the avoidance primary coping mechanisms. The walls don't come down because they're attacked. They soften because they're no longer needed. For the first time, the avoidant experiences connection without the familiar fear of being consumed. They feel closeness that doesn't threaten their autonomy. They can exhale inside the relationship instead of constantly monitoring it. This is unfamiliar territory. Their nervous system begins to associate another human with calm instead of vigilance. And that association is powerful because the body learns it before the mind can rationalize it away. This is why the bond goes deeper than typical attachment. It isn't formed through intensity or dependency. It's formed through regulation. The empath becomes a reference point, a felt sense of emotional safety the avoidant didn't know was possible. And once the nervous system encodes that experience, it doesn't simply disappear when the relationship ends. This is what people mean when they say the bond becomes imprinted. It's not romantic fantasy, it's physiological memory. The avoidant may leave, withdraw, or convince themselves they're better off alone. But their system has already learned something new, that closeness doesn't have to equal danger. And once that truth is felt, not intellectually, but somatically, it changes them quietly, permanently. Distance works for avoidance until it doesn't. When an avoidant leaves a connection, they usually expect one thing above all else: relief. Space has always been their reset button. Distance is how they regulate overwhelm, regain emotional control, and return to a sense of internal order. In past relationships, stepping away meant the tension faded, the expectations disappeared, and their nervous system settled back into familiar solitude. Leaving worked. It restored balance. That's why avoidants trust distance so deeply. It has always been their safest solution. But when the bond was formed with a super empath, distance doesn't behave the way it used to. Instead of dissolving the connection, it quietly activates it. The absence doesn't feel like freedom. It feels off, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. Yet something doesn't settle the way they expected. The quiet isn't as calming. The independence feels hollow instead of grounding. And that's when confusion begins. The reason is simple, but deeply unsettling for an avoidant. The empath never attached through need. They didn't rely on constant reassurance, attention, or proximity to feel secure. They attached through presence, steady, regulated, non-invasive presence. The bond wasn't built on how often you spoke, how much reassurance you gave, or how intensely emotions were expressed. It was built on how the avoidant felt in your presence. And that kind of bond doesn't disappear when contact stops. What the avoidant misses isn't the conversations. It isn't the messages. It isn't even you in the way they would normally define missing someone. What they miss is the internal state they only accessed around you. The calm, the emotional quiet, the sense of being accepted without being examined. That state became associated with you, and their nervous system remembers it long after the relationship ends. So when life becomes stressful, when intimacy appears elsewhere, or when they feel emotionally dysregulated, their system looks for the familiar baseline it once had, and because that baseline wasn't created by distance. Distance can't recreate it. No amount of space restores what was lost. Instead, the contrast becomes sharper. They begin to notice how tense they feel again, how guarded, how easily overwhelmed, and without realizing it, their mind starts circling back to the one place where those defenses didn't feel necessary. This is why leaving doesn't break the bond. It removes the external connection, but it leaves the internal imprint untouched. The avoidant can rationalize the decision, justify the exit, even feel confident they did the right thing. Yet their nervous system tells a quieter, more persistent story. Distance no longer brings relief. It brings awareness. And that awareness follows them long after they're gone. They tell themselves they're fine, but their body knows the truth. Avoidants are exceptionally skilled at emotional suppression, not in a chaotic or dramatic way, but in a clean, controlled, intellectual manner. They explain feelings away. They rationalize ending. They convince themselves that what they felt wasn't that deep, that the bond was situational, that leaving was logical and necessary. On the surface, it looks like strength. Internally, it feels like order. This is how they maintain stability, by keeping emotions contained, categorized, and minimized. But while the mind can deny attachment, the nervous system operates on an entirely different level. It doesn't respond to logic, it responds to experience. And once the body learns what regulation feels like in the presence of another person, it stores that information. The nervous system doesn't forget safety. It doesn't forget resonance. It doesn't forget what it felt like to be calm, grounded, and emotionally unthreatened while connected. This is where the internal split begins. Mentally, the avoidant tells themselves they're fine, that they're better off, that independence has been restored, but physiologically, something is missing. Their baseline shifts, they're more reactive, more tense, less settled than they were before. And because this change happens quietly, without emotional drama, it often goes unnoticed until stress enters the picture. When life destabilizes, when pressure mounts, or when emotional closeness appears in a new form, the nervous system automatically scans for what once worked. Not consciously, instinctively. It looks for the one environment where it didn't have to stay on guard. The one connection that didn't demand performance, explanation, or emotional labor. The one person who didn't cost them their independence. And that's when the empath surfaces in their mind, not as nostalgia, not as longing, but as a felt memory, a sensation, a contrast. Thoughts appear uninvited. Moments replay without emotional charge, yet with surprising clarity. There's no romance attached to it. No dramatic yearning, just a quiet recognition. Something felt different there. This is unsettling for avoidance because it contradicts the story they've told themselves. They didn't want to be attached. They didn't feel trapped. They didn't lose anything important. And yet their body responds differently than their narrative allows. Calm becomes harder to access. Connection feels louder elsewhere. And the absence of that former regulation becomes increasingly noticeable. This is the power of nervous system memory. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't argue. It simply waits, resurfacing when defenses are lowered, when control slips, or when the system is overwhelmed. The avoidant may never verbalize it. They may never reach out, but internally, the bond remains active. Because while the mind can deny what happened, the body remembers exactly who made it feel safe. They try to replace you and quietly realize they can't. Avoidants often appear to move on quickly. Sometimes they enter a new relationship soon after leaving, or they seem emotionally unaffected, grounded, even relieved. On the outside, it looks like confirmation that the bond wasn't as significant as it felt to the other person. But what's actually happening is familiar territory for an avoidant. Motion without depth, newness without regulation, activity without safety. Replacement relationships usually begin with a sense of control. The avoidant chooses someone who feels manageable, predictable, or less emotionally perceptive. At first, this feels comfortable. But over time, something becomes noticeable, not dramatically, but persistently. The connection feels emotionally loud. There are more expectations, more reactions, more unspoken rules to navigate. Even subtle needs feel heavier because they require constant awareness and adjustment. This isn't because the new person is doing something wrong. It's because most people connect through expectation. They bond by asking, needing, signaling, and seeking reassurance. That's normal. That's how most relationships work. But to an avoidant nervous system that once experienced attunement without pressure, this feels conditional. Love begins to feel like performance again. Presence feels transactional. And the quiet ease they once had is nowhere to be found. The super empath didn't connect through expectation. They connected through attunement. They sensed shifts without demanding explanations. They responded without needing proof. They offered emotional availability without pulling for more. This created a dynamic where the avoidant didn't feel managed or monitored. They felt met subtly, consistently, and without obligation. That difference is everything. Because once an avoidant experiences connection that doesn't require constant emotional negotiation, they can't unknow it. They may not consciously compare partners. They may not sit and think about the empath at all, but their nervous system does the comparison automatically. Every new connection is felt against the calm they lost. Over time, this creates a quiet dissatisfaction, not enough to cause immediate withdrawal, but enough to keep them emotionally guarded. They feel more on edge than they remember being, more aware of themselves, less at ease. And instead of attributing this to the absence of attunement, they often blame intimacy itself. They conclude that relationships are demanding, that closeness is draining, that independence is safe. What they don't realize is that they're not reacting to closeness. They're reacting to the absence of what once made closeness feel safe. And because that experience was unique to the empath's presence, it can't be replicated through effort, attraction, or compatibility alone. This is why the bond lingers, not because the empath was perfect, but because the connection introduced a level of emotional quiet the avoidant didn't know was possible. And once felt, that calm becomes the silent standard, shaping every connection that follows, whether they acknowledge it or not. The bond didn't survive because you held on. It survived because you let go. Avoidants are conditioned to associate closeness with pursuit. In their past experiences, connection often came with pressure. Someone wanting more time, more reassurance, more certainty. Chasing, even when subtle, activates their defenses because it signals expectation and emotional obligation. Over time, they learn to equate attachment with loss of freedom and distance with safety. This is why pursuit usually weakens bonds with avoidance rather than strengthening them. But the super empath didn't anchor the connection through control. They didn't hold the bond together by monitoring behavior, demanding consistency, or seeking constant validation. Instead, they anchored it through consistency without attachment. Their care didn't fluctuate based on reassurance. Their presence wasn't used as leverage, and their emotional availability wasn't dependent on how much they were chosen. This creates a paradox that deeply confuses avoidance. You were available, but not dependent. You didn't disappear emotionally, yet you didn't cling. You were loving, but not consuming. Your affection didn't feel like something that had to be managed or earned. You were present, but not invasive. You could be close without crossing into their internal boundaries. For an avoidant nervous system, this combination is rare and destabilizing in the best way. Because there was no chasing, there was no need to pull away. Because there was no pressure, there was no urge to regain control. The avoidant could move toward you at their own pace and retreat without punishment. And that freedom made the connection feel safe rather than suffocating. The bond grew not through intensity, but through trust and emotional autonomy. This is why the bond doesn't collapse when contact ends. It was never held together by constant reassurance or pursuit in the first place. There were no emotional strings being pulled, no dynamic of reward and withdrawal. The connection wasn't something they had to maintain through effort. It existed because of the emotional environment you created. When contact stops, an avoidant usually feels relief because the pressure disappears. But with a super empath, there is no pressure to be relieved from. So when the connection ends, something else is felt instead: absence without conflict, space without resolution. The quiet remains, but the regulation is gone. and that's when the bond becomes noticeable. The avoidant realizes, often much later, that what stayed with them wasn't something you did. It was who you were, your emotional steadiness, your ability to love without grasping, your comfort with letting things unfold rather than forcing outcomes. That internal posture can't be erased by time or distance. This is the quiet truth. Bonds formed through chasing fade quickly. Bonds formed through self-possession endure. And because you didn't try to hold on, the connection had nothing to break. Silence for most people feels like relief from a super empath. It feels like loss. For an avoidant, silence is usually a gift. It means the pressure has stopped. The emotional demands have faded. The need to respond, explain, or regulate someone else's feelings is gone. Distance restores their sense of control and brings their nervous system back to familiar ground. That's why withdrawal has always worked for them. Silence equals safety. But when the empath goes quiet, something very different happens. Not because the silence is dramatic or punitive, but because it's clean. It doesn't carry anger, guilt, or emotional hooks. It isn't used to provoke a reaction or regain. It comes from self-respect, a natural pulling back once presence is no longer reciprocal. And that distinction changes everything. The avoidant doesn't feel panic. They don't suddenly long or chase. Instead, they feel something far more unsettling: disorientation. The emotional environment they had adjusted to simply disappears. The familiar warmth without demand is gone. The subtle attunement they didn't consciously rely on is no longer there. And without it, their internal world feels sharper, more rigid, less forgiving. What's missing isn't contact, it's regulation. The empath functioned as an emotional mirror that softened their edges. Someone who reflected calm instead of conflict, understanding instead of interrogation. When that mirror disappears, the avoidant is left alone with their defenses again. The old coping mechanisms come back online, but now they feel heavier than before. This is the moment where silence stops being neutral. It highlights a contrast. The avoidant didn't want to examine. They notice how guarded they feel again. How quickly irritation returns. How effortful connection feels without that quiet presence absorbing emotional friction. And because no one is asking them to process these changes, they're forced to notice them on their own. This is when reflection begins, not emotionally, but somatically. The avoidant doesn't sit down and analyze the relationship. They simply feel the difference in their body, the absence of ease, the return of vigilance. And slowly a realization forms that silence didn't restore them the way it used to. What makes this so powerful is that the empath isn't trying to be missed. There are no messages sent, no reminders offered, no attempts to reinsert themselves into the avoidance emotional world. The silence stands on its own. And because it's grounded rather than reactive, it becomes impossible to dismiss as manipulation. In that quiet, the avoidant confronts something they rarely face: the cost of their defenses. The empath's absence doesn't attack them, it reveals them. And in that space where there's no one softening the edges anymore, the avoidant begins to understand what they lost: not a person, but a way of feeling safe with another human being. They don't miss you at first. They miss the version of themselves they were with you. Avoidants rarely romanticize the past. They're not wired to replay emotional moments or dwell on what was lost. Once they leave, they focus forward on regaining independence, restoring internal order, and reestablishing emotional distance. This is why, in the early stages after separation, they often seem unaffected. There's no visible longing, no nostalgia, just movement away from what felt complicated. But time has a way of revealing contrast that logic can't erase. As days and months pass, something subtle begins to register. They notice they're more guarded again. Their emotional responses are sharper, less flexible. Small interactions require more effort. They're quicker to withdraw, quicker to feel overwhelmed, and less grounded in moments that once felt manageable. Nothing is wrong, but something is missing. At first, they don't connect this shift to you. They assume it's just life, stress, or the natural rhythm of independence. But the body keeps track of patterns the mind ignores. And slowly, a comparison forms. Not consciously, but experientially. I didn't always feel this tension. I didn't always have to protect myself this much. The realization doesn't arrive with emotion, it arrives with awareness. This is the turning point. They begin to recognize that there was a version of themselves that only existed in that connection, a calmer version, a more open one, someone who didn't need to stay on guard because nothing was being taken from them. And the unsettling part is this: that version didn't come from effort or compromise. It emerged naturally in your presence. That's when the quiet realization lands, often unexpectedly. That connection didn't ask anything from me, and I walked away anyway. There's no blame attached at first, just confusion. How did something that felt so undemanding still end? Why did they leave a dynamic that didn't require them to shrink, perform, or defend? This is where regret begins to form, not dramatically, not emotionally, but deeply. It doesn't look like longing or heartbreak. It looks like self-awareness, a subtle recognition that the bond was rare, not because it was intense, but because it was easy in a way they hadn't experienced before. Avoidants don't regret losing people the way others do. They regret losing internal states. And when they realize that the calm, grounded version of themselves was tied to you, not through dependence, but through emotional safety, the weight of that loss becomes undeniable. By the time they fully understand what the bond was, it's already in the past. And that's what makes the realization so heavy. They didn't just walk away from a person. They walked away from a way of being that they may never find again. And that truth settles slowly, quietly, and permanently. You can suppress a bond. You can't delete it. Avoidants don't end bonds the way emotionally expressive people do. They don't process them through grief, discussion, or emotional release. Instead, they compartmentalize. This is one of their most refined survival skills. When something feels too complex, too vulnerable, or too destabilizing, they don't confront it, they store it carefully, efficiently, out of immediate reach. So when an avoidant leaves a super empath, they don't erase the bond. They file it away, they place it in a mental room, they don't visit often, a sealed off space where emotions are contained and memories are stripped of intensity. On the surface, it looks like moving on. Internally, it's avoidance disguised as resolution, but the room remains intact. Inside it is the memory of emotional safety without pressure, calm connection without obligation, being seen without being consumed. These aren't experiences the avoidant revisits willingly, because opening that door threatens the story they tell themselves. That distance equals peace, and autonomy requires emotional isolation. What makes this bond different is that it doesn't stay dormant forever. It doesn't demand attention, but it responds to specific triggers, moments of safety, familiar emotional tone, silence that isn't cold, but grounded, calm intimacy that doesn't ask for more. These experiences act like keys, and suddenly the door cracks open. And when it does, everything the avoidant avoided comes rushing back. Not in chaos, not in emotional overwhelm, but in clarity, a vivid contrast between what is and what once was. The body remembers before the mind can intervene. The nervous system recognizes the texture of something familiar and rare. This is why avoidants often feel unsettled in moments that should feel peaceful. A quiet evening, a grounded conversation, a sense of emotional ease with someone new. Instead of comfort, there's disturbance. Something doesn't align. The room has opened, and the comparison is unavoidable. They may close the door again quickly, reassert independence, recommit to distance, tell themselves it's nostalgia or imagination. But each time the room opens, it opens more easily. The bond becomes harder to ignore, not because they want it back, but because it continues to exist without their consent. This is the part most people misunderstand. The bond doesn't haunt the avoidant because of unfinished business or unresolved feelings. It persists because it was encoded at the level of the nervous system. It changed what calm feels like. And once that internal reference point is established, it can't be unlearned. Avoidants are masters of avoidance, not erasure. They can suppress awareness, delay reflection, and keep emotional distance intact. But they can't delete an experience that taught their body it was safe to connect. That bond remains, waiting quietly, surfacing not when they choose, but when their defenses momentarily rest. The bond exists but it's not your responsibility to carry it alone. For super empaths, this is the ultimate lesson. The power of the bond was never in holding on and chasing or in trying to guide the avoidant back. Their strength lies in being real without attachment and offering presence that is steady, grounded, and non-demanding. They don't manipulate, they don't cling, and they don't measure their worth by whether the avoidant returns. Instead, they maintain their integrity, their self-possession, and their calm, allowing the bond to form naturally and powerfully on its own terms. This is a truth that many empaths struggle to accept. It feels counterintuitive to let go, to step back, to relinquish control when someone they care about remains in their orbit, even indirectly. But this is precisely what gives the bond its resilience. Avoidance, by nature, resists pressure, control, and emotional dependence. If the empath had held on tightly, the bond would have weakened, not strengthened. Instead, by embodying detachment without coldness, empathy without consumption, the super empath created something avoidants rarely encounter, a connection that didn't threaten their autonomy, yet touched them deeply. Whether the avoidant ever returns or not is irrelevant to the impact of the bond. It has already done its work. It left an imprint on their nervous system, a reference point for emotional regulation, calm, and connection without compromise. The avoidant may move on, appear unaffected, or convince themselves that the bond no longer matters. Yet, beneath the surface, the experience remains. They have felt a type of closeness that can't be recreated, and that memory quietly shapes their future behaviors, choices, and relationships. For the super empath, the lesson is equally transformative. The bond demonstrated that connection doesn't require self-abandonment. Loving someone fully doesn't mean losing oneself, chasing, or sacrificing boundaries. It showed that true influence comes from presence, authenticity, and emotional steadiness, not from manipulation or pursuit. The empath learns that their value isn't measured by whether the avoidant returns, but by the energy they brought into the connection and the example they set for what love can look like when it's safe, free, and unpressured. This type of bond is rare. It isn't replicated through intensity, drama, or emotional negotiation. It is encoded in calm, in attunement, in presence, without need. And because avoidants rarely encounter it, it leaves a lasting impression, one that no amount of distance, suppression, or rationalization can fully erase. It becomes a reference point they carry quietly, influencing how they relate to themselves and others for years to come. Ultimately, the super empath must understand this. The bond exists, but it doesn't depend on their effort to maintain it. Its power is inherent in the way it was formed. It transforms the avoidant, whether they recognize it or not, and it affirms the empath's own capacity to love fully without losing themselves. That is why no avoidant ever truly escapes this kind of bond, and why it is, in its own quiet way, permanent.